Hey guys, I'm here today to talk about the rest of the novels and short story collection I read during the summer. These are all literary fiction, I would say. I've got 9 books to talk about. I'm going to talk about them from my least favourite to my most favourite. We have every star rating in it, but we don't have a 2-star. We have every other star rating, which doesn't happen often. So, 1 stars happen very rarely. Shocker, this is a Daphne du Maurier book. So I've read quite a few Daphne du Mauriers. I went for a phase years ago of reading like 4 or 5 of them in one hit, and then over the last few years I've only read a couple, which I've still enjoyed, although I have DNF'd 2 of them. But I wish I'd DNF'd this one, and so the reason 1-star reads don't happen very often for me is because I love DNFing. I'm a massive supporter of DNFing. There's too many books and not enough time in the world, so why carry on reading something? But because this was a short story collection and the first story, The Birds, is amazing, I kept hoping there would be another one in there that would make it worthwhile. There's only 6 stories in it, so I just kept thinking, well, what if like the last story is another brilliant one and I miss out and never experience that? Because The Birds, as a short story, if you can find it alone, which I'm sure you can, it's a really famous short story, definitely pick it up and give it a read because it's brilliant. But the others I really didn't like. So I was trying to figure out what the difference was between the Birds and the rest of the stories. And I realised The Birds is about a working class family. They're nice, good people. All the birds become killer birds, and it's about them trying to survive that. There's a real sense of unease and fear, but the parents trying to hide that from their children. I thought it was really well executed, very scary, and it really made me think about how I'd be absolutely fucked in a survivalist situation because I can't even put a shelf up, let alone board all my windows and doors. I'd be screwed. The other 5 stories found really dry and tedious and just quite bleak, and I was having to force my way through them. All the characters are very wealthy and just snobby and not nice people, and I also found that they were quite offensive. So the one I thought was particularly offensive, and I know this is a book of its time, but I think it was The Little Photographer, I think that's what it's called, and it was about this woman who starts to sort of have this liaison with this man who is taking her photograph, and she keeps going to meet him out near the coastline. She describes him as having a club foot. She says quite a lot of offensive things about his appearance and the way he walks. It just hasn't aged well. As a modern day reader, it's horrible to read. And there's also a short story in here called The Apple Tree, which is about a man whose wife dies, and the apple tree in the garden sort of takes on the persona she had. And I couldn't quite place whether Daphne du Maurier wants us to side with the living husband or the dead wife. I know where my loyalties lied. I felt like the man was a complete dickhead, and the wife, I felt really sorry for her, but I don't think that's what she wanted you to feel, so I don't know. I thought this was overall very boring, dull, offensive, dry, other than The Birds, so I did own the dolls in this edition, but I'm not going to keep it. I don't wish to read any more of her short stories, thank you very much. The next book is The Prettiest Star by Sickles. I listened to this one on audio, so I'll put a cover up here for you to look at. This isn't released in the UK yet, so I listened to it via script. So I really hope to love this book, and when I finished it, just a few things didn't work for me, and also since then it's become a rather forgettable read for me, so this one just really didn't do what I hoped it would do. So this is set in 1986, and the majority of the story takes place in a small town in Ohio. We follow a young man in his mid-20s, I think, who travels back to his small hometown after being diagnosed as HIV positive, and he's previously lost lots of his lovers and friends in New York to the AIDS epidemic, so he decides to come home. And when he was in New York, he was starting a career as I never really know what you would term this as, like a videographer, like a documentary maker. And so he has filmed lots of the lives of his friends and lovers, and he decides that during his decline he will film his life and the life of his family, and then, you know, leave these tapes for them and hopefully to show to other people, if they ever reach a wider audience, what the lives of all the people he knew were really like. And this is told from the perspective of the protagonist Brian, his mother and his younger sister. She was like 5 years old when he left, and he's been gone for a really long time, and she didn't know he was gay, and she also now doesn't know that he's HIV positive. His father like just won't discuss it, and there's lots of shame around it. And as we follow the story, he's obviously declining. People in the town want to know what's wrong with him. People start to make guesses. There's lots of quite horrible scenes with the way people treat him. But throughout all of that, he has a really excellent relationship with his grandmother. And I thought that was one of my issues. I felt that his younger sister added nothing to the narrative. Her and her mother's voice were quite similar, and I just didn't really feel the necessity of her as a voice. I felt that it would have been better to have the grandmother or the father than the young girl. I also felt that in particular the young girl sections were a bit florid. Like there's a point where she describes she's really obsessed with the ocean. She wants to be a marine biologist. And I thought sometimes those points were just a bit overwrought. So she describes herself as, after she does something at school to sort of defend herself, she describes herself as feeling like a killer whale swimming down the corridor. And it just felt a little bit overdone. Like, I get that she's into marine biology. I mean, there was just lots of lines like that were like, I get it. And I also felt that the way this came together at the end, I felt we really lost Brian's voice. The narrative became much more focused on his mother and his sister, and I think that was a real shame. Like, he's the protagonist, it's about what's happening to him, and it felt like at the end the author forgot that a little bit. So I thought it was like well written. I had some issues with the writing, but I think the narrative just like fell apart a little bit for me at the end, and that's what's really made it not have that final impact. I think he captured Brian's life brilliantly. He captured what it would have been like to be alive around that time, surrounded by people you were losing, and what living with the illness would have been like. You know, the way he describes what's happening to Brian's body is devastating. But yeah, I think other than Brian's story, it just got a little bit lost, and yeah, it just didn't completely work for me, unfortunately. Then the next one we have is Coming Up for Air by Sarah Leipciger. I think that's how you say this. So I read this over about 2 months because I just put it down for ages and then finally picked it back up and read like the final third. And I just feel a bit ambivalent towards this one. This is set across 3 timelines and they're all linked by the idea of breathing. So we follow a young woman in Paris in 1899 who kills herself. Then we follow a toy maker in 1950s Norway, and then who has sort of lost someone in his life due to something to do with lungs. And then we follow a woman in present day Canada who has a condition which means that her lungs are basically failing her, and so she really struggles throughout her life with her breathing. And it's beautifully written. She writes brilliantly about the natural world, in particular in the scenes in Canada. That's really well done. She writes historical fiction well. The scenes in Paris were really great, and there's an element of drama to all of the narratives. But what I found was that there's a few segments to this that you could pull out and would be excellent short stories, beautifully written, have a great narrative arc, leave you with a bit of questions unanswered. But once it was put together as a novel, I just didn't feel like the narrative arc really worked. Like, they don't really pull together enough for me. I don't want to spoil how they do pull together, but it's not enough to put them alongside one another. And I also just felt like, and maybe this was because I read it over such a long period, and I am aware of that with this book. I feel like if I had read this in the case of a week or two, maybe I would have given this 4 stars, and maybe a lot of it is due to the fact that I put it down and had such a big gap. But I also wonder why I didn't feel inclined to pick it up again for so long. So yeah, beautifully written. I'd be interested in whatever else she writes, but I personally feel like these should have just been short stories in a larger collection, so it didn't work for me. Then Sad Times, we have one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that is Writers and Lovers by Lily King. I previously read Euphoria by the same author and really enjoyed it. I haven't read any of her other books, but I really like the sound of this one. One thing I will just say is I really don't like the UK cover or the US cover. I know lots of people really love the US cover. I think they're both not very nice, which is a shame. Anyway, so the premise of this is we follow a woman in her late 20s who has recently lost her mother. Her mother died like really suddenly while she was on holiday, and they don't really know what happened completely, and she was super close to her mother and she's not really dealt with it, and she went away to a writer's retreat and had this big love affair, and then he cut it off and she just feels like everything's fucked basically. She works in this really fancy restaurant and then writes in all of her spare time, but she's had writer's block for ages and she just feels like her life's going nowhere. She has lots of medical problems, she has loads of student loan debt, and she just feels shit. And she meets these two men, one of whom is around her age and is a writer, and he's also sort of struggling to pull his life together and seems a little bit unreliable to begin with. And then another man who is older than her, he's widowed, he has 2 young sons, and he's a published, very successful author. And she starts sort of dating both of them, and you follow her as she does that, but also as she just tries to get through each day. I will say, if you are struggling with feeling low, or if you don't like to read about grief, loss of a parent especially, or you know, really struggling with where you are in the world, I don't know if this is the best book to read. Now sometimes some people find that reading something that, you know, puts into words exactly how I feel is really helpful. Sometimes it isn't. So, you know, this is you know, in large part does feel fairly bleak. I'm not going to spoil how it ends, but in large part it's quite bleak. So I was disappointed because, okay, there's really long scenes in the restaurant. This is an issue I had with Rain by Milk by Paul Mendes, which I read recently. You get whole segments where she's in the restaurant and you keep getting told what the customers' orders are, and you keep getting told how many tables she has to serve, and you keep getting told what the chefs say. And I get that she's trying to portray how relentless working in the restaurant is, but there's only so much of it we as a reader need to hear. I just don't think it's that interesting, and we don't need like lots of different scenes of the same thing happening. I also found that for a significant, I feel like when I was first introduced to the two men I was a little bit interested, and then right at the end I was a little bit interested, but mainly I just kept thinking, just bin them both off. You're obviously very unwell, sort out everything that's going on with you and how you feel about yourself and your health, and then maybe you'll be ready to try and find somebody else. But both of these men have problems, like why bother? And so I guess a big part of the plot is maybe supposed to be you rooting for one or other of the men, and I didn't love that. I did love the exploration of the older male author, which I won't spoil, but I thought that was done really well, and you can tell that you know, Lily King's a writer and moves amongst other writers, and there were some sort of jibes there which I enjoyed. I liked the ending. So this is like a 3.5 star read for me. I feel, and one thing I will say is there's lots of descriptions in this about how when her sort of problems start to overwhelm her, she gets to the point where her skin feels like, she describes it as having bees underneath her skin. And I think she did that really well. And yeah, so I thought some bits of it were brilliantly portrayed. This is obviously a very autobiographical novel. Lily King has openly spoken in interviews about how she lost her mother very suddenly, at a similar age to the author, at a similar time period as this book is set, around when she was trying to get her own novel published. So I think it's quite interesting because a lot of authors do this whole autobiographical novel as their debut, and instead this is like, I don't even know, like her 5th novel maybe. So, and obviously there's lots of elements that just are not part of her life at all, but yeah. So I enjoyed this one, but nowhere near as much as I hoped. Like, I was thinking this could be a 5-star read. Alas, it wasn't. Okay guys, I've turned the light on, and I know it's probably very yellow, but it's just started pouring outside, it's really clouded over, and I could not be bothered to get the studio light out, so yellow lighting it is. So the next book, I'm really sad it's at this stage in the video, because again, I would have thought this would be like a 5-star read, and this is probably my most anticipated release of the year. And that is Summerwater by Sarah Moss. So, you've probably heard of this because lots of people on BookTube love Sarah Moss's books, rightly so. This is set on a small holiday park in Scotland where they're like wooden lodges, and there's not many lodges there, and it's following a group of people who are all staying there during a weekend where there's just torrential downpour. They're all on their summer holiday and they can do bugger all because it's just pissing it down. And therefore they're all very aware of one another and sort of watching one another. And you move through a character in each lodge. Sometimes you come back to a different character in the same lodge, like, you know, you read from the husband's perspective and then a few people later you get to the wife, that sort of thing. And you sort of follow this story, and interspersed with these character focused stories, I guess, there's these 1 or 2 page sort of vignettes which are focused on geography and the like natural world of this location. They're beautiful, they're absolutely stunning. I'd read a whole book of those bits. And they're also quite ethereal and very atmospheric. When I first started, I listened to this on audio because the audiobook narrator was brilliant. And when I first started listening to this, I was like, this is blowing me away. So amazing. The opening narrative is about a woman who's getting up for an early morning run, and she just wants to have a moment away from her husband and her children. And she sort of introduces you to the landscape around these lodges, and it is stunning. And as you move through these storylines, you get a sense that something's going to go wrong. And within one of the early vignettes, you get told that not everybody will be okay. And so you immediately start to, within each story, you're thinking, oh, there's an element of danger in this story. And there is really in all of them. Some of them very subtle, but it's there, so you start to be on the lookout the whole time, which it gave me the same sense of unease as Ghost Wall did, which is her previous book, which was also sort of novella length, and I loved Ghost Wall. So there was this building sense of dread. I didn't love every single section as much as all the others. That's just personal preference. If you read a book like this from multiple perspectives, you're always going to have your favourites. Being someone who's read all of Sarah Moss's books, listened to her in interviews and on podcasts, this feels very Sarah Mossy in that you can tell that she's trying to get across lots of her perspectives through these characters. There's lots of comments on the refugee crisis, on environmental destruction, climate change, those sorts of things, motherhood, feminism. And so, you know, sometimes, every now and again, it does feel like she's using some of her characters to sort of voice her own opinions, or to voice the opposite of her opinions and make clear how ridiculous they are. And I think you wouldn't notice that as much if you hadn't read all of her books. But I still really enjoyed it. What made this not be a completely wonderful book for me is it does pull together at the end to something happening, and I felt that it felt very anticlimactic for me, and I also would be interested in hearing Sarah Moss talk about what she wanted the reader to take away from this. There's a big plot line of people being ignorant and being very cognizant of only wanting British people in these lodges, okay? And there is an Eastern European family in one of the lodges, and lots of people have things to say about that. And I wonder, like, how the book ended, what we were supposed to feel overall about that commentary. Yeah, I don't know. So this is like a 3.5 star read, like beautifully written, but I just didn't necessarily feel that this pulled together as well as I would have liked it to. So the next book I'm going to talk about I also listened to on audio, but again I have a physical copy, which I'm very happy about because this is perhaps the most beautiful book of the year, and that is the Subtweet by Vivek Shraya. So I'm going to be really rubbish at describing this plot, let me get this right. We follow 2 musicians, both in Canada. I'm pretty sure Canada because Vivek Shraya is from Canada. And one is an indie music singer-songwriter called Davies, and she creates all of her own music, she writes her own songs, and she is amazing but not super successful, but she's very aware that she never wants to sell out for fame or for money. Another woman called Rukmini starts to do cover songs on YouTube, and she covers one of Neela's songs and it becomes way more famous than the original. And these two women then connect online via social media and start to meet one another in real life, and we follow their story from there. There's a portion in this novel where they're like obsessive friends with one another, and they really build one another up, and they do all the things you want you know, creative, successful women to do for one another. And then something happens online which sort of causes a massive rift, and you then watch the fallout. I don't want to spoil what that is now. What I loved about this is because it tells both their stories and sort of tells you what's being said online and what journalists are saying about this big fallout, you get lots of different perspectives, and it's one of those books which asks you to question what your first judgment may have been of the situation. One of my favourite things in novels is when you're given a situation and you immediately side with one character because you think, no, that person's been really bad, like I completely get their perspective, and then more is revealed about the other person and you realise it's way more complicated than you originally thought. You shouldn't have judged immediately because you didn't know enough, and then you end up being so unsure about what you should think. And I think that's what was done brilliantly in this novel, so I really enjoyed it in that sense. I also think the way she writes about the music industry, and the beauty of women, and the way women are presented online, and the way we love to tear them down was really excellent. I guess the only thing that perhaps stopped this from being a 5-star read for me is it's quite slim, and I feel like it maybe just would have been stronger if it had been a bit longer. And a lot of the times I think a book is the right length when it's this short, but I just felt like this could have maybe had a bit more to it, and I would have loved it even more. But I really enjoyed this. I'd highly recommend it, and I'll definitely reread it because it was such a quick read. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it, so definitely pick this one up. And the next one was also on audio, and loads of you will have heard of it, and that is Such a Fun Age by Kiley, Reid. Now, I initially had zero interest in reading this book, and that is because, I'm going to admit it, I'm not a massive fan of commercial fiction, and I particularly struggle with commercial fiction which is trying to deal with like a serious sort of big social discussion such as racism, because I feel like sometimes commercial fiction does it at a really, like it really skims it. It doesn't go into enough depth, and I get it does that for a reason. It serves an audience of people who perhaps haven't read books that deal with those sort of topics before, and it's like their introduction, but it's just not where I'm at as a reader, and I tend to find it quite frustrating. And this book I felt had been marketed very commercially, and because of that reason I thought I'm just not going to be into it. But I decided to give it a go on audio because I heard a few people whose opinions I really trust really rave about it. It got put on the book along list, and I thought I'm going to give it a go. I really enjoyed it. I was completely wrong. This book has been marketed really commercially, and I think it has really, it does have excellent commercial appeal, but I think it also has a really great crossover appeal in that it actually does deal with these topics really deftly. So if you don't know, I'm going to really skim this because so many people love to discuss what this book is about. We follow a woman called Amira, who is a nanny. She cares for children. She's in her late 20s. She's African American, and she is called one night, quite late at night, to ask to go pick up the young girl she cares for and take her out of the house because they've had a horrible situation at home. They don't want their child there. Amira takes the little girl to a 24-hour really fancy deli. A white woman sees a black woman with a young white child, immediately assumes kidnap because of course she would. And the security guards come over and there's a sort of interaction. A white man films it all on video and says to Amira afterwards, you know, I'm willing to back you if you want to go to the papers, I've got it all on video. And then we follow Amira's relationship with this man who filmed the video, and also with her white employer, who's incredibly embarrassed by the whole situation, and is a sort of social media star. That's her career. She's trying to write a new book. her life's floundering. She's recently moved from New York, and she's really struggling and doesn't really know what she wants anymore, and she doesn't feel sort of current anymore. And for various sort of racist reasons, really, she decides that Amira is young, current, cool, hip, and that she wants to get to know Amira as much as possible and be best friends, and she starts to be a bit weird around Amira. And the reason I think this was excellent and necessary is that there are a lot of books that have been published over the last, I don't know, 100 years, and a lot of books coming out now, excellent books that deal with racism. And they deal with racism a lot of the times at its worst. And what this book is doing is dealing with racism that lots of people, particularly white people, wouldn't recognise as racism. Even the people who think they're the most left-leaning and the least racist person ever, a lot of people, I think, would be like, that wasn't racist, that was just absolutely fine, like what was wrong with that? I'd do that. And so this book is pairing these two white people who in different ways are both dealing with Amira oddly because of her race, and neither of them recognise it. And I thought it was really excellent because of that. I also just loved the relationship between Amira and the child she was caring for. I thought it was done beautifully, and I really think the audiobook narrator just did the little girl's voice wonderfully. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I don't want to spoil anything, but like the ending for me, I wish there'd have been like a bit more of a bang maybe, but I also get how it made sense for the narrative. I've heard a few people make comments about the believability of this book, which I find bizarre, because one of the things I've heard people say is they find it really unbelievable that the parents would have called Amira to remove the child from the house. And when I first started reading it, I thought the reason they call her, like, it feels like it's not a big deal for her to have just stayed in her bed. But actually, as soon as you get to know Maurier, the little girl, she's very neurotic. She worries, she obsesses, and it makes complete sense that they'd want to remove her from the house. And also, in terms of who Alix is, the mother, it also makes sense that she just couldn't be asked with Maurier being there. So yeah, I found this all completely believable. I thought it was really well written. I'd read anything the author brought out in future. And I watched a really excellent interview with her, which I loved. She's super funny and engaging, so I'm going to link that down below because I really, really recommend it. She tells lots of funny stories about various elements of her life which fed into the novel, and I just found really lovely to hear, so I recommend it. Next book I'm going to talk about, I gave 4.5 stars to. I really love this book and I'd highly, highly recommend it. And that is The Atlas of Reds and Blues by Devi S. Laskar. So, I love the sound of this book, and I ordered it from the US, and when it arrived I was a little bit worried because I didn't know if I was going to love the writing style, but I did. So, this is about a woman who, as the novel opens, is found shot on her driveway. She's just been shot by the police for a crime she didn't commit and she has absolutely nothing to do with. And we find out throughout the rest of the narrative, which is told in vignette style, that she is the American-born daughter to Bengali parents. She married a white man and lives in a very white neighbourhood with her daughters, and her husband is away a lot travelling for work. And there's just a ton of racism from her neighbours, from the police, from people around her, and she lives a pretty horrible and depressing life. And the reason I was worried I wasn't going to like this when it arrived is because this is told in vignette style, but nobody is ever referred to by name, so they're always referred to by role. Her husband is always called Hero of the Hour because she feels like he saved her when he first met her. Her daughters are referred to by their age, so it's like middle, youngest, oldest, and she is referred to either as mother, wife or daughter, depending on what that section is about. And I like to get really close to my characters, and I was like, oh, I don't know if this is going to feel too distanced and like cold and stark. It doesn't. It's absolutely brilliant, and actually telling it in this style, non-chronologically, makes it quite relentless, because you're told about so many everyday moments of racism that she has to suffer from her husband, from her neighbours, from the police who are supposed to be there to protect her, and it's relentless. And it being told completely out of order also gives you an idea of the state of her mental health because of all of this. It is, yeah, and even though it's quite, sometimes feels quite staccato, it's also quite descriptive, so you really get a sense of what everybody looked, you know, even the way this opens up. I really like that first, so this is the first couple of sentences just after she's been shot. Now this fainting, this falling, this landing so ungainly, concrete scratched her face, the back of her arms, her legs twist like licorice, which I thought was just an excellent description. So I love this book, and I tried to find interviews with the author because I think this is actually based on a real life event that happened to her. I think she was actually shot by police for having committed no crime other than being brown in a world in which people preferred her to be white. But I couldn't find any interviews, so if you found any or have any more information about this author, I'd love to know, just because I want to know that she's okay, she's written this novel, but it was excellent. And the fact that it's out of order means that you get these moments that are about people like trying to get in a door, and it's all just makes you feel very uneasy, and it's really well written, very well delivered, feels very relentless, and I think has a really big impact. So 100% recommend, and I will read anything that she brings out in the future. So there's that one. And the last book, and one of my favourite books of the year, which I think everybody should read, is Mr. Loverman by Bernadine Evaristo. I listened to this on audio, which I would highly recommend because it is brilliantly narrated. I absolutely loved this book. And I will say, in these horrible times, this book I found to be really uplifting and hopeful. It deals with difficult topics, but it has a group of wonderful characters, and even if you meet people for a moment, they feel so well realised and warm and true. So I'd really recommend this if you feel like you want to read that won't make you feel like shit. So this book focuses on Barry, who moved from Antigua many years ago. He is 74, he is married unhappily, and he's been having a relationship with his best friend Morris since they were young boys. They've been having this affair for about 60 years, and he is considering divorcing his wife and trying to finally live an openly gay life with Morris, whether to tell his daughters this and to admit this to all the people they know, and just to live out the last years of his life being true to himself and the man he loves. And you follow this from mainly Barry's perspective, but we also get segments about Carmel. And this again is told, some of the sections we look back, and they'll reflect on how they met one another when they were young and why they got married and the early years of their marriage with their daughters, and you learn a lot about both of their daughters and their lives. And also Carmel has a group of lady friends she knows from church, and they come around the house a lot, and you find out a lot about them and all the devastating things in their past which make them perhaps not be the nicest ladies now. It's beautiful. Okay, it is so happy. It's set in Hackney, I'm pretty sure, and Barry is like a man about town. He wears very dapper suits, wonderful hats. He has a very high sex drive. He knows he's attractive. He has a very large ego, and he just thinks he's brilliant. He thinks he's really intelligent. He's self-educated, and he loves himself. But he's still a really wonderful man. And what I think is brilliant about this book is it handles topics, predominantly racism and sexism, really serious topics which can be really bleak and depressing and hard to read about, but it handles them in a way where none of the seriousness is lost, none of the gravity is lost, but you don't feel that like you've lost the warmth of these characters in those moments. You don't feel like any joy has been taken from the novel. You love Barry, even though he's pretty sexist. He's pretty homophobic himself. He, at one point in the novel, goes into a gay bar and he does not like any of the other men there. He thinks they're camp, he thinks they're embarrassing him, And he has lots of judgments, particularly to do with a woman's place and all the mistakes his wife made, and what should be done for him, like his laundry and his dinner, which make him really unlikable, but yet you still love him. And he thinks awful things about Carmel, but when you hear her story, you really feel for her, and you want her to have this wonderful life, and really you want everyone who you meet to have this wonderful life, because Bernadine Evaristo gives you the humanity in all of these people. And even though you meet so many of them and think, oh, you hypocrite, oh, you bigot, oh, you blah, 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 yet she gives you the warmth and the love and the joy in every individual in this story. It's beautifully written. I don't often find books funny. I thought this was really funny. It was just joyous. I think that's the perfect word to describe it. I've read Girl, the Woman, Other. I loved it. I loved this more. I thought this was absolutely phenomenal. And I'd just reread it in a heartbeat. So I think everybody should read it, and I think everybody should read it at a time when they're feeling a bit low, because I really think this book was super uplifting, and just a complete joy. So please, please read it. So yeah, those are all the books I read during the summer, or all the ones I'm going to talk about in this segment anyway. I still have the non-fiction books to talk about, and then my summer reading wrap up is done, and we can move on to talking about some more autumnal books. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books, and if so, what you thought of them. I'd love to know your thoughts down below. Also let me know if you plan on picking any of these books up. Also love to know your thoughts. And I always want book recommendations. I have too many to read, as you can see, but who doesn't need more recommendations? So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!